Hello, this is Stanley Nelson, co-founder of Firelight Media and executive producer of the documentary short film series, In the Making.
Hi, I'm Michael Cantor, executive producer for American Masters on PBS and also executive producer of In the Making.
The In the Making series follows emerging cultural icons on their journeys to become masters of their artistic disciplines. Across 9 episodes, you'll meet creatives who are making work that explores and influences American culture today.
Season 2, which premieres weekly on the PBS YouTube channel at pbs.org/American Masters and the PBS video app, features visual and performing artists, a poet, an actor, and a chef whose work collectively is redefining American culture today.
We're proud to present each of the 9 episodes of this season, all of which are directed by filmmakers of color, many of whom have been supported by Firelight Media's artist programs.
Now, to introduce today's Beyond Resilience event, which spotlights 4 filmmakers from the series, it's our pleasure to introduce Christine Turner. Christine is a filmmaker who spotlights tender, intimate portraits of people in socially charged landscapes. Her latest film, Janae Bridges' Unamplified, about the Grammy-winning mezzo-soprano, was recently broadcast on American Masters as part of the In the Making series and is now available to stream on our website, pbs.org/American Masters.
Christine is an alumna of Firelight Media's documentary lab, through which she produced and directed the critically acclaimed documentary Homegoings, about a renowned funeral director in Harlem. In 2021, she directed the documentary short film, Lynching Postcards, Token of a Great Day, for which I was proud to serve as executive producer. The film was shortlisted for an Academy Award and won an NAAC Image Award. Welcome, Christine.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Christine Turner. My pronouns are she, her. I am a brown-skinned woman with curly brown hair, wearing a black, green, and purple shirt. I'm a Firelight Media documentary alum, as Stanley mentioned, with a bit of experience about creating films about other artists. And as part of Firelight Media's American Masters current season, I directed a film called Janae Bridges' Unamplified, about opera singer Janae Bridges, which was broadcast on PBS in March, along with Dilsey Davis's film on the country music artist Reese Palmer. The films are currently available to stream at pbs.org/American Masters. I have directed portraits about artists such as Amy Sherald, Kehinde Wiley, and Betty Saar, to name a few. Currently, I'm also working on a project about an influential jazz musician. Before we begin, I'd like to make a land video acknowledgement to raise awareness about Indigenous history with Indigenous people, Indigenous history and land rights, to express our intention to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I am in San Francisco on the land of the Ohlone. We all have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism and genocide. Now, before I begin to introduce our amazing panelists and discuss their process of creating work about other artists, let's play the Beyond Resilience series trailer.
Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight.
Beyond Resilience does a lot to keep people connected, keep people talking about films, talking about issues, connecting our filmmakers and other filmmakers together.
We wanted to create a space where our community, that is BIPOC documentary filmmakers, could lead a conversation.
We have to do a better job of knowing that films aren't just what we can physically see on the screen. It's about the people that put in the blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Knowing that what you're so passionate about, someone looks at as unmarketable or niche. Who's the audience for this? Who's going to care about this, right? And those simple things that people say are like daggers to you.
I think that is the part of the violence of the minority shit, that like shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
We have always resisted. We have always fought back in many different forms.
It's an evolving form. You have to evolve, or not you will stagnate.
You have to have intention to change, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better.
What we're asking for is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives.
I hope that Beyond Resilience will keep its edge, will keep pushing the boundaries of the conversations that we need to have, and will keep growing its audiences, pulling in new people from the industry, outside the industry. It continues to be a space where people can have a BIPOC creator-led conversation. That is what it's about.
Okay. I also wanted to make a note that our ASL interpretation will be completed by Andrea Lust for today's show. Thank you, Andrea. So now I'd like to introduce each of the panelists and show a clip from their upcoming film as part of this season's In the Making series. First, Sergio Rapu. Sergio Rapu is a documentary filmmaker native to Rapa Nui. His content priorities are in uplifting underrepresented voices and telling stories about environmental conservation. His award-winning directorial debut, Eating Up Easter, was screened around the world and broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens in 2020. In 2021, he produced and edited Bring Her Home, the latest feature by director Layla Hale, which follows 3 Indigenous women as they work to vindicate and honor their missing and murdered relatives who are victims in the growing epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. As one of the only Native Rapa Nui working in documentary film, he seeks to uplift underrepresented voices and create thought-provoking media around environmental conservation. Let's see a clip of Sergio Rapu's Jonathan Thunder, Good Mythology.
Good mythology is so far-fetched that there's no way you could have made it up. So it has to come from somewhere, which makes it amazing. Even though both my parents are from the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation, I never knew about the living, breathing, storytelling world that exists for the Anishinaabe culture. It was almost like through my artwork, I became a productive member of my tribe.
Next up, Alicia Edwards. Alicia Edwards is a director based in Miami, Florida. Her love of visual storytelling developed in her early career as a network news producer, with work featured on CNN, NBC, MSNBC, and BBC. She has earned fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Florida Humanities Council, and a special jury award from Oolite Arts. Her most recent short documentary was a commissioned collaboration between Oolite Arts and community justice project called Village Free Edge. She earned her MA in Transnational Communication and the Global Media at Goldsmiths College of University of London in the UK. Let's watch a clip from Walshy Fire, Pull Up.
Walshy's one of the greatest MCs that I know.
Energetic, floetic, and just simply amazing. The guy is a talent at its true form, and he just does it with such a bravado, no fear. You want to do exactly what he asks you to do on that microphone.
I mean, I've been doing this for 28 years now. I just know that, yo, I'm happy. So it's kind of hard for me to not put out happiness. But I reap happiness because of that. And I see how it just turns over. I don't consume my music, man. I'm really consumed by music.
And finally, I'll introduce Alan Dominguez, a co-director alongside Raul Paz Pastrana of Alejandro Jimenez, The Ground I Stand On. Alan Dominguez is a Mexican-American filmmaker in Denver, Colorado. He recently wrapped production on a documentary short for the Beyond Graduation series in conjunction with nabbed, World Channel, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He also directed the short doc Clever, about the journey of a former MS-13 member out of the gang life to his current life of working with youth. The film has been shown throughout the US as well as the Morelia International Film Festival in Mexico. Let's watch a clip of Alejandro Jimenez, The Ground I Stand On.
If the brown body is not seen as worthy, is neglected, is deprived of light, of sage, let it grieve. Let it remake itself. Let it rejoice. Let it remake itself. Let it rekindle itself. When I need to make sense of something, I write about it. When I need to make sense of something and I can't write about it, I'll run about it. Sometimes when I'm having trouble writing a poem or I need to work through something, I'll run. And somehow during a run, it just comes. And so for me, it's a way to, in writing, reclaim and create new things. I love that about writing, what it does for me, how it allows me to connect with people.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan, Alicia, and Sergio. It's so great to have you here. I want to start by asking all of you a couple of questions. And maybe we'll start first with Alan. I wanted to say that, you know, each of these artists were new to me. So there was discovery in watching each of your films. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first encountered the artists that you profiled or their work, and what compelled you to want to share their story and their process? We'll start with you, Alan.
Sure. Thank you for having me. This is really an honor to be included with you all. So very good to see everybody again. Alejandro and I we actually worked at the same school in our neighborhood here in North Denver, which has been a predominantly Latino neighborhood until fairly recently. And so Alejandro I knew through his poetry, through poetry slams and performances around the city. And then he's also like has this mythical following in North Denver, because you see this guy running these great distances and doesn't stop to talk to anybody, has this very intense look on his face. And when I figured out who those two people that were actually the same person, and then we ended up teaching in the same school together, it was really kind of a cool aha moment. And then I started really digging into his poetry, and the co-director on the film, Raul is also an immigrant from Mexico. And he had this real visceral connection to Alejandro's poetry. And when we combined all these elements, it just made perfect sense that Alejandro was a great subject, a great participant, and was very humbled and allowing us into his process. And so we're very grateful for that. And yeah, it was really an amazing ride.
Excellent. And Alicia, how about you?
Hi, thanks for having me today. I'm really glad to see everybody again as well. Thank you to Firelight. Thank you to Ulite Arts. I grew up in Miami's dancehall culture, big sound system scene, especially as a teenager. And while she was a participant, a merchant, a DJ, all of those things in that time, and it's just been, really incredible to watch his ascent from like these really local hyper, subculture and to these worldwide stages.
Excellent. And Sergio, tell us about Jonathan.
Yeah. Also, thank you for having us on here. What a great series to be part of. Jonathan, I met working on an earlier project on Bring Her Home, which was directed by Leah Hale. It was about the MMIW epidemic, and he had done some animation work on that project. And just sort of, working with him on that, I really just came to appreciate his demeanor, his personality. He's a very sort of calming presence, very warm. And so, in the era of COVID and hyper danger everywhere, I mean, I think I really gravitated to individuals where, that I kind of wanted to hang out with a little bit. And so, kind of looking into this call a little bit more when this came out about trying, looking for an artist that's doing this type of work, I dug in a little bit more into the work that he himself does. And I was kind of blown away by, again, his sort of like personality in his work. It's sort of very inviting painting and sort of animation. So yeah, we just hit it off.
It makes a lot of sense to me now that now that you say that you had met on a previous film, because I felt a lot of intimacy in the filmmaking and a sense of closeness that was quite remarkable. This leads me to wonder if you or anyone could talk a little bit about your collaboration with the artist on this particular project, and what were the kinds of discussions and ideas that informed the direction for the film? Any of you are welcome to take that on.
In our case, it was, Alejandro has a growing body of poetry. And so it was really trying to figure out how we were going to represent that visually. And his poetry is it's about a lot of things, with the immigrant experience, a lot of themes that are recurrent, but he also has this sense of honesty that I thought was really unique. And that sometimes, he talks in very frank terms about his past and about the relationships that his immigration status has affected. And it was really trying to curate, an impressive body of work and how that's going to work visually. So it was definitely getting him to not necessarily open up, because his poetry is very public. He's a performer, but at the same time, perform a lot just for us, kind of off camera, and then from there really kind of see and dig into those themes that we see they're overplaying themselves a lot, and really trying to bring the audience into where his headspace is. So he was very, very much a part of the collaborative process.
Yeah, writers can be difficult to depict visually, right? Because often they're writing down in a notebook or at the computer or something that we don't think of traditionally as like very active or visual. But I thought you did a really wonderful job using his running as a metaphor and helping us to understand how central it is to his artistic practice and cooking as well. So those are really great ideas in terms of how to translate his work and his process on screen for us. So for those of you who haven't seen the film, please check it out, check all of the films out, and you can see what we're talking about. Sergio, talk to me.
Yeah. I ended up filming with Jonathan prior to actually getting a green light or sort of, getting funding, because I was trying to figure out, I know I wanted to do a film about him, with him, but was trying to figure out what's the trajectory, what's the arc in it. And the arc was happening now in my head. And so I ended up, just sort of picking up a camera and going and filming. It ends up being, a piece in the film that's installed at the Minneapolis St. Paul International Film Festival, or at the airport here. And in that process too, it was kind of, I think we got to know each other better. And I think Jonathan even saw that, I was willing to spend my own time and energy and money to do something that in the end may not turn into anything, right? It was just sort of continuing to build that relationship because it just felt really good to do it. And eventually it worked out, and we sort of got funded and we were able to make the film. But I think even regardless, it was a great experience of just spending time to explore a relationship. I think that's so critical. I think whenever we get into films especially about individuals, you want them to feel as invested in the project as you are as a filmmaker.
That makes sense. And I'm so glad that you took that risk and went out there and started filming even before you had the official green light, right? Filmmaking is risky, and there are a lot of challenges that come along the way. I know for me, oftentimes there's been a challenge just in terms of finding the time to film with an artist. Alicia, I'm curious, for you, what were the kinds of challenges that you faced, and were there any constraints in making your film about Welsh Fire?
Definitely. I'd say that that's where most of our collaboration lied, was in logistics, because he is an active, traveling, working artist who, when he's in town in Miami, he has studio hours, he has parties that he throws here. So I think that was the biggest challenge, because I could call him and he'd be in Paris or he'd be in Fiji. And, I didn't know when he'd be back, what his time would look like. I mentioned it at Big Sky, but another director who had worked with him, Austin Peters, told me, just show up. If he's scheduled to be somewhere, just go there. And that's how we worked it out. And in collaborating, he was super open with us working through the list of people that we would interview, and his family was super open about archival. But I definitely say that the largest challenge was logistical.
I can definitely identify with that. And you bring up an interesting point, because I think the other two films are told from a singular point of view, right? The artists in their own words, so to speak. But your film actually branches out, and we do hear from, as you mentioned, colleagues and family and friends. And I think there's a few historians in there as well, which provide, a much bigger context for what he's doing. Can you talk a little bit about why and how you decided to incorporate the voices of those people?
Sure. I'm a fan of Walshy's. I think that the work that he does is incredible. And despite the Grammys and the accolades, he's super humble, and getting him to really talk about himself wasn't something that he was so comfortable with. Pulling in his mom, I thought, was really, really important and interesting. One, because she'd never been interviewed before. But two, I think that the push and pull factors that brought his family to the US and to Miami in particular were really important. And even though we don't see it, we don't get to explore it, just when you hear her cadence of, voice, the rhythm that she's, the way that she speaks, you realize, oh, wait, there is more to this story. So I thought that was really, really crucial. And the people that come at the different junctures of his life just seem to be pushing him a little, further along, from his uncle to his bandmate to people that were in pirate radio with him. They're all from different stopping points along his journey. And history, I think, is at the root of this story. I'm obsessed with dancehall, and I'm really, really interested in sound system culture, but it has a very deep history for us as the children of immigrants, and to pop culture as well.
Well, music, I know, especially can be challenging to access for any documentary film. And I think archive in general is becoming increasingly difficult to access and sometimes quite expensive. I'm wondering, each of you bring in a certain amount of archive, or at least the artist's work, into the film. But for those of you who may have licensed other third-party material, whether it's music or cartoons, can you talk a little bit about any licensing or estate coordination that was required to really bring your films to life? Is there anyone who wants to speak on that?
I'll start. I have a lot to say. on licensing, especially with music, because Walshy was really open in sharing his music. He has albums, but in so doing, one song may have 3 producers. And if all 3 producers don't agree, then you can't use the song. Maybe the producers agree and the pianist doesn't agree. Or maybe the pianist and the producers agree, but the publishing company doesn't. And you've got to go through all of those layers to get music. And I thought that I would use fair use, but it has its limits. And then with music being so tricky, also with our archival footage of those early dance hall concerts that you see in Jamaica, the videographer was willing, very graciously, thank you, Mr. Reggio, to share the video, but he couldn't legally license the audio because it was copyrighted by other companies. So there were all sorts of legal negotiations that were happening. And for me, the music was so central to the story. Like I wanted everybody to turn on the video and feel bass and hear dance hall and want to like buckle and wind down and dance. And we couldn't do that, but we had to find ways to keep the story still nuanced and in Walshy's voice without the music that really had guided my whole search into his world.
Sounds challenging. I think though you found a way, some very creative ways around the material that you weren't able to license. Does anyone else want to talk about different kinds of challenges they might have experienced? It doesn't have to be about archive, by the way, but any other kind of like practical, useful knowledge that you may have gleaned in the process of making these films?
I mean, I didn't have necessarily challenges with music. That sounds super hard. Alicia, I didn't realize. So I'm really happy to do a music doc. But you know, I did early on talk to Jonathan about licensing his material, and I think, you know, it's super important for us as filmmakers to have conversations around compensation with the people that we're filming, that we're, you know, exposing their lives and things like that. And so that was important. There was also sort of a racist clip that we used within the doc from Bugs Bunny. And so, you know, I was super hoping that we could use fair use. And of course we got that cleared. And so that worked out, you know, in our favor. But, you know, sometimes fair use is tricky to use, and it also depends on the legal team that's reviewing it, you know, how confident they feel about it or not. And so, yeah, it's a tricky situation, but I'm glad we were able to do it.
And in our case, Alejandro is not exclusively a self-published poet, but he mostly is, and the stuff that we were able to use was stuff that he had published himself. So that part wasn't too much of a challenge. And again, props to both of you for getting clearances that would have been tough to get. Yeah, music I can't imagine. What we also did was we included some news clips from when he was younger, and the idea being is that there's just something about the palpable nature of like a black and white photo from a newspaper that just develops this sense of history and this in the sense of place and time to Alejandro's past. And we really wanted to flesh out his past and how, you know, he really does live with both the past and the present in one breath. And so that was very, very helpful that we were able to get those clearances. They weren't too difficult to get, but they were used very, very intentionally.
Yeah, those newspaper clips added a really nice texture to the film. And plus, you got to see Alejandro's various different hairstyles over the years, which I also really appreciate. So this question goes to any of you. I mean, how, if at all, did any of your artists' stories, narratives, maybe dovetail with your own as a filmmaker? What themes did you identify with, maybe personally, or what elements of their stories, you know, spoke to you most just because of your own experience?
If I could jump in on that, just because, you know, I'm not an immigrant in the sense that I was not born in another country and come here, but my parents on both sides are from northern New Mexico. And as you drive south from Denver, you get about 200 miles south and you just feel the difference. There's just a difference in the landscape, and there's a difference in language, and there's a different sense of difference in time. And this is the first time that I ever gotten to work in New Mexico. And so that was really special to me. And Alejandro, of course, he talks about being a person of indigenous roots, and he's running on these lands that were part of the first successful revolt in this hemisphere against a European power. And so to be able to weave all those things, to me, was very personally rewarding, and to see all of those things come together and to really explore the sense of space, a place that I had never really explored, just the landscape that is northern New Mexico, was very, very special to me. And both Raul and myself, and then Alejandro, we all just kind of got it. We all understood, why we were getting up at the crack of dawn on a freezing cold day in January to get to the right place at the right time, because we wanted to connect all those dots for an audience that those stories kind of get lost sometimes.
Yeah, you could really feel the sense of place, how important that was to the story. There were, I'm thinking back to, there were a number of aerial shots, of the landscape, and that lent itself, that created a feeling, a bigger feeling, right? I did wonder how early you got up for some of those sunrise shots. But good for you guys. Alicia, what about, I know that you grew up on Walshy's music in a way, but was there anything about his story, his personal narrative, that really spoke to you as an artist?
Yeah, definitely. We both grew up in South Florida. We both have Jamaican parents who came here during a very particular era and carried, some of the emotional baggage that comes with living situations that can be politically volatile. We both grew up here with parents who were really, really deeply concerned about our education. The Caribbean immigration story is a little bit different than others because our parents spoke English, it's a huge advantage. They came here educated already for the most part and had professions that they could bring with them. So that does give a novel twist to kind of, like the American dream and seeing the world as an immigrant, but also this feeling that there's an obligation to fulfill the promise that your parents made in a way, and that need to strive to kind of justify them coming here. Walshy does value education very highly, and that's something that I only got to put in that one snippet of a picture of his college graduation, but he has a graduate degree. He's super intellectual, and I definitely identified with that push. That push that he would have felt at home. And culturally, when I went to see his mom, she made me a big cup of tea, and we could talk about these same mile marker posts in my life and her family's life as well. So I think that really helped me to feel more intimately connected to them. It felt really like an extension of my family, which can be a tricky place to be between participant and observer. But I did feel a deeper obligation. And our community is very rarely represented on TV. And so I definitely felt the weight of our community being able to see Jamaican American culture up on the big screen.
Yeah, I had that thought watching your film as well. And I also appreciated also just the diversity within that community and culture that was really displayed in the film through the interviews themselves, and the richness and the sort of quote unquote melting pot that Miami is. And it felt, I also just felt viscerally the Miami heat. I think you also captured a kind of energy and sweat, if you will, through your filming that gave us a sense of being there. I also love that, by the way, that what you said about meeting Walshy's mom. Sometimes when you meet someone's mom, it's you understand that person that you're filming in a different way. You're seeing them in a different light. So I'm glad that the two of you were able to connect in that way. Sergio. Are there elements of Jonathan's story that also you identify with, or maybe mirror your own experience?
Yeah, absolutely. First is he's addicted to caffeine, which we hit it off pretty well. He has an espresso. Like the first time, I came into his house, he like made us all espressos, and like we talked for like an hour about his like favorite shop in the city where he got his roast from. But I think, like more on a serious note, I think we're both in the same stage of life, I would say. He's a new father. And I have sort of two little boys that have really kind of changed my perspective on life and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I would say similarly for him. And so we had got a lot of conversations around being Indigenous fathers. I'm not Indigenous to Minnesota. I'm not Anishinaabe, but so much of the parallels around trying to figure out how to pass down tradition and language in sort of a very Western world, and a very capitalist society. And then on top of that, essentially being an artist and how do you make art pay the bills, right? So from that level, I think we're really connected, and I learned a lot from him. I think, I see him as a very successful artist. And I remember having a conversation with him after we finished a session of filming at the airport, in talking about a little bit of like my frustration about really kind of what was happening in Minneapolis at the time, a lot of civil unrest and protests and things like that. And my interest in wanting to be out in the streets and filming what's happening and documenting and all of that. But then also sort of my pull to responsibility to be at home, with my family and making sure that home is safe, and happy for my kids. And I remember him just kind of giving me, sort of really great advice. I think he had gone through it too. And he said, like, we all have our tools, and you can help in a different way. You don't necessarily have to be on the streets with a camera, right? Raising good children for the future is as important. So I really kind of took that to heart, and really just, have continued to kind of on and off connect with them about, our paths and being fathers. So
I really appreciate you sharing that, and I love that he said that to you. I certainly know as a mother, like feeling very, a new mother, feeling very similar, 2-3 years ago about like, can I be out in the streets when I have a baby or a toddler? And it reminds me of something an artist I profiled, Betty Saar, spoke of. She is now in her 90s, but she talks similarly about the demonstrations in the 60s, and in particular after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and how much she wanted to be out there, but she had 3 young children. And of course, she found her way of speaking truth to power through her art as well. But I think we don't often hear the male artists talking about being a father. And so that's an important subject that you, I think, capture in the film, and by what you just said. Okay. I want to make sure we leave some time for our listeners who are here, but I wanted to ask a couple more questions. So let's see, Alan, can you talk to us a little bit about, your process of how you tried to showcase? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but if there's anything else you would like to add about how you chose to showcase Alejandra's poetry, and find that sort of balance in the storytelling of the various elements you pulled together.
Sure. Some of Alejandra's poetry is just, again, it's brutally honest. And he talks about difficult relationships he's had, and we played with a few different ideas of which poems we're going to give the breadth of his experience. And so we ended up on the ones that we ended up picking out because there was some very strong connections between a scene that's the beginning of the film and a scene that's the end of the film. And then I think the biggest challenge we had was Raul and I specifically remember this conversation when Raul, he calls me up and he says, okay, this is looking okay. How are we going to show his process? And then we just kind of had this moment of like, oh my God, how do we show that process? And so the clip that we played at the beginning of the panel today is actually the perfect one to look at, just because you see him struggling, and it's a matter of jump cutting. And then I wanted to cut to this empty table, like he's abandoned ship, like he's abandoned the computer, he's abandoned the pen, and I'm just going to hit the trail. And that was the idea of and that's really what he does. And it was balancing the runner with the poet. And is he a runner first or is he a poet first? And he's both. I mean, and it's we were really trying to strike that balance. You know, as a runner, he's a poet, and he's producing at a very specific time in human history, at the same time that calls upon the generations. And so there was a lot of balancing to do, and we wanted to keep it very simple to do that. And I think just in that simplicity is where the audience is able to connect a lot of those dots, whether they can relate personally to them or not. But I think it's just, we do understand what it's like to struggle to get something out. And certainly as a filmmaker and as an editor, you know, it is a struggle, and it's often a solitary struggle. And so that was what I really enjoyed about cutting the film together, was to really be true to that struggle that is Alejandro's and is really of any artist.
Yeah, I thought a lot about, I'm not a runner, but I do know for a number of people how important that running is to kind of getting those ideas flowing. I'm more of a walker, let's be honest. I like to walk. Alicia, I mean, while she's part of this, you know, top selling act, Major Lazer, for those people who don't know, you know, what is it like working with such a big artist? You've spoken already just about how the challenges of scheduling, you know, when they're touring and the recording and things like that. What were the other things that maybe you came up against in working with such a big artist, and was it ever intimidating? Again, this is somebody who you've looked up to and admired since you were a teenager, you know, and how were you able to comport yourself?
To comport myself, I really grew up around reggae music and the industry here in Miami. And so maybe it doesn't feel as far away as if he was like in LA and I had to make like more logistics, but usually it was like, I'm outside your house, come bring me the video. So that, you know, there's no intimidation there. But also I want to say that he is in Major Lazer, a huge group, some of the best selling and most streamed songs in the world in recent pop music history. But I also made a really conscious effort to make this a film about Walshy Fire, because he was Walshy before he joined Major Lazer, and the work that he started before he joined Major Lazer, he continues, and he does work on his own and on the side as well. So I don't think of intimidation as much as I was afraid to talk or as I was afraid to say something. I just don't think that was in my nature, which I think helped a lot. But yeah, I think above all, I wanted to highlight him. I think that some of the biggest conversations that I had were proving that his craft had merit. There were a lot of conversations around like, he's a DJ, he's a producer, why is that important? And for me, it's like, you know, the role of a musician in Afro-Caribbean culture is up there with a religious leader. It's really, really respected. And to have to prove that over and over and over was a challenge internally for me, to have to prove and represent and stand for something that I believe in so deeply. But yeah, aside from Major Lazer, it's Leighton. His mom calls him Leighton. Like those are barriers, but they really didn't come up. They didn't come up in our interactions.
Excellent. And I do appreciate the ambition of telling a story like his. And your point also, just that like sometimes these groups can kind of obscure the artist in them. So I'm glad that you chose to focus on him, right, as opposed to the other larger group. Sergio, so one of the things that Jonathan talks about is this idea of him being an Indigenous artist versus an Indigenous artist who creates broad artwork. Can you talk a little bit about how he sees, how he identifies and how he defines himself as an artist? And also, if you would share a little bit about your choice to use animation and part of the film. I thought that was a really fun, inspired choice.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, like the animation part, I'll answer that first because it's easier. Jonathan, he's multi-talented. He paints, he's an animator, he's a filmmaker too. And so kind of walking into this relationship, I was like, oh, dang, a filmmaker making a film about a filmmaker. How is this going to work out? But he was super gracious and sort of, essentially giving me his animation files. I had this nutty idea, he's very surrealist in his paintings and really just like a lot of his stuff. And so I wanted to put him in this like surrealist world. Like, how can I have melting clocks behind him and sort of like all of that. The way we were able to kind of make it work is to pull some of his animations and lay them into sort of the real world that we picture him in. And then my cinematographer had the great idea to shoot it anamorphic. And so we're even sort of further, pushing into this sort of cinematic, surrealist kind of world, and kind of trying to be really intentional with some of the shots that we used. And so that was fun. I do remember having a conversation with Jonathan of like, do you want to do the animation in your own film about yourself? And he's like, no, I would be way too precious with it. Like you need to find somebody else. And so we ended up contracting somebody who Jonathan recommended, Mary Villiard, who's also a Indigenous animator in Duluth, it worked out really well. I think on the sort of topic of like being an Indigenous artist, I think this is something else that him and I kind of connected on, is that I think we both, and I know I definitely do, I struggle with, how sometimes we get pigeonholed as the artist of color, the filmmaker of color. Oh, Sergio's Latino, he can probably do this film. Sergio's Indigenous, he can probably, like, let's check that box. And sort of, do we take those roles? Like, how does that impact us as filmmakers when we're potentially, and I think this is, the behind the curtain, how we self-judge ourselves, at least me, am I being hired because of my background, or am I being hired because of my skill? And so often I want to be hired for my talent, for my skill, not necessarily because of like a tokenized checkbox that somebody's trying to fill, so we sort of had like, back and forth. And I think Jonathan was really clear too. It was like, I want to be hired as an artist, not as an Ojibwe, artist. And so I think like I've like ruminated about this a lot since our conversation. And for me, I realized that it actually, I think it has to do with like a coping mechanism that I have with this like imposter syndrome, right? I think that maybe sometimes we all feel when we're in a space where we're the only ones in that space. And so I don't feel like I'm good enough to compete. And so I sort of self-deprecate a little bit in terms of my talents, like, why was I hired for this job or something like that? Anyway, I feel like I'm on a super big tangent, but ultimately, I think, I think it's something that I definitely, as a filmmaker of color, question myself about all the time, and am learning to deal with it by trying to get over that imposter syndrome, to feel comfortable in spaces that where I'm the only one and say, yeah, I'm good enough. I'm hired here to be here because of my talent and my skill.
Well, I can tell you, you got the skills, Sergio. You got the skills. But I do think that that is something that, yeah, a lot of us filmmakers of color especially grapple with. And but I do want to say that each of you are incredible filmmakers, and your skill and the beauty and the way that you tell the stories really comes through, and it's really individual. Each of the films feel really different and unique, and I appreciated the touch that each of you gave, your personal touch. It sounds like we need to move to audience questions. So let's make a little time for that. Ronald is asking, what is the best approach to ask someone to collaborate with you on a project? What should you be prepared to share or show? Okay, I don't know. Does anyone want to take that on? It's kind of a big question, and I think there's a lot of probably depends. Many of you had some kind of, relationship to your subjects prior to approaching them about maybe your projects. But if there have been instances where maybe you didn't necessarily know your protagonist so well, how might you approach them, and what kinds of things would you share or show?
I can take a stab maybe. I think, we always talk about this, but building trust early on. Trust is FaceTime early and often and throughout, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a camera the first time. It actually means you shouldn't have a camera the first time you meet them, and that you see them more often, or as much without a camera that you do with a camera. Oftentimes, I think people that haven't been in documentary media before, are also unaware of the implications of what it may mean to them once the film is out. And so having those conversations with them early, and I try to be as honest as possible about, well, I think this is kind of what the film is going to be about, but I'm not really sure until later. I think is important. I try and make it clear that it's a journey that sort of shifts and turns based off of the character's life also, so that's how I've kind of approached it, I think, in the past.
Really good advice. Others want to share any thoughts?
Sure. I just want to echo what Sergio was talking about. Just in those relationships. I mean, and being honest about what it is that you see in their story, because in some cases it's something that they had never connected, perhaps. I mean, and in Alejandro's case, I mean, I think he's new to Santa Fe, New Mexico. He had not been there for very long when we actually did the film, and so he's discovering that sense of his new home. He's discovering that sense of place and realizing that it's a very natural place for him to be in. And it was cool to capture that discovery about the place. So.
And maybe even, framing it in those terms too, that the film is going to be a discovery, right? And that there is an openness on our part as filmmakers to going on this journey and finding out, what it is, and not necessarily predetermining so much, I think can often be a way to approach a film with a protagonist. And of course, listening, right, to what they have to say and centering that first and foremost, if that is your approach. I know for me with Janae Bridges, we just had a few really long Zoom conversations to begin with because we were not in the same place. And I just wanted to hear about her thoughts and her journey and try to absorb as much of her perspective and point of view before I even began to sort of think and shape, what the film might be. Alicia, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I'll just echo that trust is really, really major. And I think that it's an honor really to tell somebody else's story. And it's so important to, one, to honor that trust and to respect the part of the story that they're sharing with you. I think that that was really crucial, because there's some things that, I may have learned, but that I would never share. And how much does it mean to you to be ethical rather than to get the story? And I think that that's like an ongoing conversation that journalists and filmmakers have had for eons.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to tell someone's story, right? And they are in a very vulnerable position that we have to respect and understand with the various power dynamics that are going on. So having that awareness is really important. Okay, there's several more questions here. One from Nishan Dion. Nishan saying, Deadline recently published an article in which a female executive explained why she advocates against paying individuals to participate in documentaries. As filmmakers, how do you typically handle compensating participants in your films? This is kind of a, it can be a very controversial question and subject matter to discuss. And obviously, depending on your distributor and maybe who you're making the film for, there are going to be different kinds of rules as well. But if anyone wants to speak to, like if this has come up in this film or in other films, how you've thought about it and how your thinking may maybe even has evolved over the years, that would be great.
It didn't come up for us in this film, and it doesn't because it's not a practice that is usually embraced. I personally have had a lot of thoughts about this, and I've heard other filmmakers, and this is one of those film festival conversations that we have in the lobby, and just talking about those, because it's a delicate balance, because they're at this, it's in one hand, I mean, there's the obvious conflict of interest when money changes hands. And the other part is also a little bit about just honoring people's time, because when you make a film about somebody, you're asking them to really put themselves out there, which is uncomfortable as it is, and you're asking them to do a lot of things. You're imposing on them a lot of time, depending on what the scope of the film is. So it is definitely tricky. It is definitely a tricky balance.
I mean, I would always advocate for compensating the people that are featured in your film. I've been on productions where the line is, we don't pay anybody for interviews, but then all of a sudden we wanted a really high power interview by an expert that had an agent, and they negotiated a fee. And so I've found oftentimes that those that are able to negotiate a fee are already sort of privileged in a particular way, because they have a PhD, because they have an agent or something like that. And I, whenever I can, try and fold in some sort of payment for the individual, whether it's even just for their wardrobe that they wore to the shoot. I know this is sort of like a really gray area and sort of really debated in the industry, and changing even more so. But I really hope that somebody can kind of come out with better guidelines, and to really help us all evolve a little bit in the process that we're making.
Excellent point. Yeah, I think there is a lot of this is something that's being debated and discussed, and that and of course every film and every scenario is quite unique. But I think we're just about out of time here. I'm curious, is there any last thoughts that anyone would like to share about any of this for our audience that's listening listening in? I know just in hearing you all speak right now, I've learned so much more about you as filmmakers and your interests and your approach. What last words would we like to share with our viewers today?
Just ones of gratitude for the whole process, gratitude to our team, Alejandro, Raul, the folks at Firelight, the folks at American Masters, just one of gratitude. And it's been a great ride. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all for tuning in to Beyond Resilience today. Thank you to the panelists for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your openness about the process. And thank you to the audience. You can watch the In the Making series and learn, and actually this conversation at firelightmedia.tv. And of course, check out all of the films. They're all wonderful, not just the 3 that were showcased here today, but there's several more online as well. Yeah, just go to pbs.org/American Masters. Thank you for joining us.